A man entered a high-end restaurant, his presence subtly disrupting the usual harmony of the place. Dressed in a plain jacket and well-worn jeans, he appeared out of sync with the polished atmosphere, where patrons were adorned in designer suits and elegant dresses. He quietly took a seat near the window, flipping through the menu with a thoughtful expression. A young waiter, barely in his 20s, noticed the man immediately. His sharp eyes scanned the guest from head to toe, his mind already forming conclusions. This was not their typical customer. He didn't radiate wealth, didn't arrive in a luxury car, and certainly didn't fit in with the exclusive clientele the restaurant catered to. The waiter smirked, adjusting his tie as he approached the table with a carefully practiced air of politeness laced with condescension. "Good evening, sir," he greeted, his tone formal but insincere. "May I recommend one of our finest dishes? Or would you prefer just a drink?" The man looked up, his face calm, almost amused. "Just water for now, thank you." His voice was steady, devoid of hesitation. The waiter arched an eyebrow. "Just water? In a place like this?" He couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. "Of course, sir," he said, barely masking his sarcasm. "Are you sure you wouldn't like something more filling?" The man met the waiter's gaze, his expression unreadable. There was no sign of offense, no trace of irritation. Just patience. "I'm sure," he replied simply. The waiter shook his head slightly as he walked away. He had seen it before, people walking into the restaurant hoping to experience a taste of luxury but unable to afford it. It was almost amusing. As he fetched the glass of water, he whispered to a fellow waiter, "Take a look at table 5. A guy dressed like he wandered in from a bus station. Just ordered water." His colleague glanced over, his lips curling into a grin. "Think he knows where he is?" The waiter smirked. "If he does, he'll figure it out soon enough." Returning to the table, he placed the glass down with an exaggerated flourish. "Here you are, sir. The finest water we offer, chilled to perfection." His tone was just a touch too theatrical. The man lifted the glass, taking a slow sip before setting it down carefully. He glanced around the room, noticing the subtle stares from other diners who had begun to pick up on the exchange. But instead of reacting, he simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that unsettled the waiter just enough to make him second-guess himself, as something about this man felt different. Yet the waiter brushed off the feeling. To him, this was just another regular night, another ordinary customer who didn't belong, but he had no idea who he was speaking to, and he was about to regret it. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation, the soft clinking of silverware against fine china filling the air. The man, still seated calmly at his table, seemed entirely unaffected by the judgment surrounding him. He sipped his water, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. The waiter, emboldened by what he assumed was a lack of confidence from the guest, returned to the table. His smirk was more pronounced this time, and his voice carried an unmistakable edge of mockery. "You know, sir," he said, leaning in slightly, "we have some rather affordable appetizers. Perhaps something within budget?" A few nearby patrons glanced over, their interest piqued. The tension in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable. The man, however, remained composed. He set his glass down, folded his hands together, and looked up at the waiter with a quiet intensity. "That's very kind of you," he said smoothly. "But I think I'll wait." There was something about his tone that made the waiter pause, just for a fraction of a second. It wasn't anger, nor was it embarrassment. It was something else entirely, something the waiter couldn't quite place, but instead of backing down, he chuckled. "Of course, sir," he said, straightening up. "Take your time." With that, he turned on his heel, making his way back toward the kitchen. As he walked away, he heard whispers from some of the other waiters. "Why are you messing with him?" one of them asked. "Just let him be." "Come on," the waiter scoffed. "You know how this goes. He's either lost, trying to impress someone, or hoping to get a free meal." He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the man looking uncomfortable, possibly even reconsidering his decision to stay. Instead, the man sat there, perfectly at ease. Watching, the waiter frowned. Something about this was starting to feel off. Still, he pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. The man would leave soon enough, either out of discomfort or because he couldn't afford to stay. And when he did, life at the restaurant would go back to normal, or so he thought. Minutes later, as the waiter continued tending to other tables, something happened that made him stop in his tracks. The restaurant's manager, an older gentleman with a refined presence, had entered the dining area. His eyes scanned the room before locking onto the man at the table. Then, to the waiter's horror, the manager's expression changed. It wasn't one of dismissal or disinterest. It was recognition, pure, unmistakable recognition. The manager hurried toward the table, his demeanor shifting from professional indifference to quiet reverence. He stopped beside the man, bowing his head slightly. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice carrying an air of genuine respect. "It's an absolute honor to have you dining with us tonight." A hush fell over the surrounding tables. The waiter's stomach dropped. Wait. Mr. Reeves, as in Keanu Reeves. The realization hit him like a freight train. His breath caught in his throat, and he felt an immediate wave of regret crash over him. Keanu Reeves, one of the most beloved actors in the world, known not just for his legendary film roles but for his humility, generosity, and kindness, and he had spent the past 10 minutes mocking him. The waiter's face burned with humiliation. He turned back toward the table, his mind racing, but Keanu hadn't even glanced his way. Instead, the actor merely smiled at the manager, nodding in greeting. "Thank you," Keanu said simply. "I was just enjoying the atmosphere." The manager straightened up, clearly pleased. "If there's anything at all we can do for you, please let us know. Your presence is truly an honor." The other diners, who had previously been sneaking glances, were now openly staring. Some even murmured excitedly among themselves, their attitudes toward the casually dressed man shifting in an instant. The waiter felt his heartbeat hammer against his ribs. He had misjudged the situation entirely. Worse, he had insulted a man who could have effortlessly embarrassed him in return, but Keanu had done no such thing. He had remained calm, patient, and now, that patience only made the waiter's shame feel even heavier. The waiter's palms grew clammy as he stood frozen in place, watching the scene unfold before him. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a physical force. Every snide remark, every smug glance, he replayed them all in his head, feeling the shame intensify. Keanu Reeves? Here? In this restaurant, it didn't make sense. Celebrities didn't just waltz in without an entourage, without reservations, without making a spectacle of their presence. They didn't just sit alone at a table, sipping water, looking as ordinary as any other guest, and yet, Keanu had done exactly that. To the manager, still standing beside Keanu's table, turned toward the waiter, finally acknowledging him with a sharp glance. "Is everything all right here?" His voice was firm, but not unkind. The waiter swallowed hard, forcing a nod. "Yes, sir," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu finally looked up at him, his expression as unreadable as before. There was no anger in his eyes, no smugness, no desire for revenge. If anything, there was something almost understanding in the way he regarded the young waiter that made it worse. If Keanu had berated him, if he had called him out in front of everyone, the waiter might have found some way to defend himself. But this quiet patience? It made the humiliation burn all the more. The manager, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside his employee, turned back to Keanu. "Please, allow us to bring you something on the house," he offered. "A meal of your choice, anything at all." Keanu waved a hand dismissively, his easygoing demeanor unchanged. "That won't be necessary," he said with a small smile. "I just came in for a quiet evening. I'm enjoying myself just fine." The manager hesitated for a moment, as if unsure how to respond to such humility. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. But please, if you need anything, just let us know." With that, the manager gave a small nod of respect before excusing himself, leaving Keanu once again alone at his table. The hushed whispers among the diners continued, some sneaking glances at the actor, others nudging their companions as they discussed the unexpected turn of events. The waiter remained rooted to the spot, his thoughts racing. He needed to say something. He needed to apologize. He took a deep breath, forcing his feet to move forward. When he finally reached the table, he could barely meet Keanu's gaze. "Sir, He swallowed, his throat dry. "I just want to say I'm really sorry for the way I treated you earlier." Keanu raised a hand slightly, stopping him mid-sentence. "It's all right," he said gently. "You made an assumption. It happens." The waiter blinked. No anger. No condescension. Just a simple acknowledgement of the mistake. But that doesn't make it right, the waiter insisted, feeling a desperate need to correct his wrong. I was rude, and I judged you without knowing anything about you. That's not the kind of person I want to be. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying him for a moment before nodding. Then don't be, he said simply. You have the power to change that. The waiter felt his breath hitch, just like that. No grudge, no resentment, just a piece of advice wrapped in quiet wisdom. Keanu took another sip of water before setting the glass down. People will always make assumptions, he continued, his tone light but thoughtful. It's how we choose to act afterward that defines us. The waiter felt something shift inside him. He had spent so much of his life trying to impress the wealthier patrons, looking down on those who didn't fit the mold. And here was Keanu Reeves, a man worth millions, sitting before him, treating him with a kindness and respect that he himself had failed to show. It was humbling. I'll do better, the waiter said, his voice filled with sincerity. I promise. Keanu gave him a small, approving smile. That's all anyone can do. The waiter nodded, standing there for a moment, letting the weight of the lesson sink in. Then, with a newfound sense of purpose, he turned and walked away, but he knew he wouldn't be the same person who had approached that table earlier, and that was the beginning of something better. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for the waiter. He continued serving tables, but his mind kept drifting back to the exchange with Keanu. It wasn't just the embarrassment that lingered, it was the realization that he had been given an opportunity. An opportunity to be better. As the night wore on and the restaurant began to empty, the waiter found himself glancing toward Keanu's table. The actor remained there, quiet and composed, seemingly unbothered by the whispers and glances still being thrown his way. He had finished his water but hadn't ordered anything else, yet he looked perfectly content. The waiter hesitated before making a decision. He stepped into the kitchen, took a deep breath, and approached the head chef. Can I ask for a favor? He said cautiously. The chef raised an eyebrow. Depends on the favor. The waiter hesitated, then glanced toward Keanu's table. I treated that guest poorly when he arrived. I made a mistake, and I want to make it right. The chef followed his gaze, recognizing Keanu immediately. His eyebrows shot up, but he said nothing, waiting for the waiter to continue. I'd like to send him something, the waiter said. Something good. On me. The chef studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. All right, he said. I'll take care of it. A few minutes later, a plate of freshly prepared pasta was placed on a tray, alongside a small note folded neatly next to it. The waiter carefully carried it to Keanu's table, placing it down gently. Keanu glanced at the dish, then at the note. His lips quirked upward in mild amusement as he unfolded the small piece of paper. A sincere apology, served with respect. Hope you enjoy. Keanu read the words, then looked up at the waiter, who stood there nervously. You didn't have to do this, Keanu said, his voice warm. The waiter shrugged, though there was gratitude in his expression. I wanted to. Keanu nodded, picking up his fork. Well, he said, I appreciate it. The waiter exhaled a quiet breath of relief, then took a step back. Enjoy your meal, sir. For the first time that night, Keanu gave him a full smile, one of genuine kindness, one that made the waiter feel, for the first time in a long while, like he had truly done something right. As the night wound down and Keanu eventually left the restaurant, the waiter watched him go, feeling something shift within himself. This was more than just an apology, it was the start of something new. A better version of himself. As Keanu finished his meal, the restaurant had nearly emptied. The once busy floor was now quiet, with only a few late-night diners lingering over their drinks. The waiter, still processing everything that had happened, couldn't help but feel a new sense of awareness as he moved through the room. For the first time, he wasn't just seeing customers, he was noticing them. Their expressions, their body language, the quiet conversations between couples, the tired businessman who had barely touched his food, the elderly woman who sat alone with a book, sipping tea as if the world around her didn't exist. He had spent so much time trying to impress the wealthier patrons, the ones who wore money like a badge of honor, that he had ignored the simple truth. Everyone who walked through those doors had a story. Keanu Reeves, the world-famous actor, had walked in unnoticed. Because he didn't carry himself with arrogance. He didn't demand attention. And yet, his presence had changed everything. The waiter stole another glance at Keanu's table, watching as the actor quietly finished his meal. There was something peaceful about the way he carried himself, as if he was completely unaffected by the events of the evening. Before he could think twice, the waiter grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and approached the table. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Reeves?" he asked, his tone genuinely polite this time. Keanu looked up, considering the offer for a brief moment before nodding. "That would be great. Thank you." The waiter poured the coffee carefully, then hesitated before speaking. "If you don't mind me asking, why didn't you say anything earlier?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Say anything? You knew who you were. You could have just, I don't know, told me off. Or left. Or called the manager right away. But you didn't." Keanu leaned back in his chair, wrapping his hands around the warm coffee cup. His expression remained thoughtful. "What would that have done?" he asked simply. The waiter blinked. "Well, it would have been fair." Keanu smiled slightly. "Maybe. But fairness isn't the same as kindness." The waiter frowned, trying to process that. Keanu took a sip of his coffee before continuing. "I've been in a lot of places where people assume things about me. It happens. And yeah, sometimes it stings. But I've also learned that how I react says more about me than their assumptions do." The waiter remained silent, taking in the words. Keanu set the coffee cup down gently. "You realized your mistake," he said. "And you chose to make it right. That's more important than anything I could have said back there." The waiter felt an odd lump in his throat. He had never thought of it that way. For years, he had been caught in a cycle, judging, being judged, trying to get ahead by stepping on others. But tonight, something had cracked open inside him. Keanu wasn't just teaching him a lesson about respect. He was showing him something deeper, the power of patience, humility, and understanding. The waiter nodded slowly. "I think I get it," he admitted. Keanu smiled again, this time wider. "Good." The moment lingered between them, quiet yet significant, and then, for the first time that evening, the waiter found himself asking something he had never thought he would. "Would you like to stay a little longer?" Keanu looked at the waiter for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he leaned back in his chair. "Sure," he said. "I don't mind staying a little longer." The waiter blinked, almost surprised at his own question. He hadn't expected Keanu to accept. Yet here they were, the famous actor and the once arrogant waiter, now simply two people sharing a conversation. The restaurant had grown quieter, the last of the customers settling their bills or lingering over their drinks. The waiter, realizing he had a rare moment to speak with someone like Keanu Reeves, hesitated before pulling out a chair across from him. I know I'm technically still working," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I feel like I need to understand something." Keanu tilted his head, gesturing for him to continue. The waiter sighed, glancing down at the coffee pot he still held. "I think I've spent so much time trying to impress the wrong people that I stopped seeing the ones who actually matter," he admitted. "Like tonight. I made a fool of myself because I assumed you didn't belong here. But the truth is, I didn't belong here, not the way I was acting." Keanu took another sip of his coffee, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, most people don't take the time to reflect on things like that," he said. "It's easier to stay the same. Change takes effort." The waiter exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah. But I don't want to be that guy anymore." A comfortable silence stretched between them. For the first time that evening, the waiter didn't feel intimidated or ashamed. He felt lighter, in a way. After a few moments, Keanu set down his cup and stood up, adjusting his jacket. "I should get going," he said, but there was warmth in his voice. The waiter stood too, suddenly feeling an odd pang of disappointment. He wanted to say more, but he wasn't sure how. Instead, he blurted out, "Can I ask you one last thing?" Keanu paused, nodding. The waiter hesitated, then said, "Why do you do it? Why go through life like this, being patient, being kind even when people don't deserve it?" Keanu chuckled softly. "Because at some point, someone did the same for me." The words hit the waiter harder than he expected. He nodded slowly, understanding in a way he never had before. Keanu extended a hand. The waiter shook it without hesitation. "Take care," Keanu said, before turning toward the door. As the actor walked out into the night, the waiter remained standing there, watching him go. Something had changed inside him. He didn't know what his future held, but he knew one thing for certain: tomorrow, he would step into this restaurant not just as an employee, but as a better person, and that, he realized, was worth more than any tip he'd ever received.